Turning now to the Saskatchewan legislature, there was swearing and screaming there this week. And no, we're not talking about question period. Of course, I'm talking about the Saskatchewan Roughriders Grey Cup Rally, which took over the building. A lot of fun had there on Tuesday. But of course, the government and opposition still managed to go back and forth over different issues over the past number of days. We're joined now to discuss that by our political panel. Murray Mandryk is a political columnist, and we're joined by our provincial affairs reporter here at CBC, Alexander Quon. Alex, let's start with you. We heard on our newscast that the Premier was, of course, at the Grey Cup and then went to Washington, D.C. What do we know about this trip?
Yes, Premier Scott Moe went to D.C. on Tuesday, meaning he missed all of the fun at the legislature for the Riders Parade. So when he was in Washington, D.C., Moe met with Trade Representative Jameson Greer, Secretary of Treasury Scott Bessent, and Secretary of Commerce Howard Lutnick. I will note the Premier did speak with Dominic LeBlanc, the federal minister responsible for Canada-U.S. trade, and met with Prime Minister Mark Carney before traveling to D.C. That was to ensure he was on the same page as the federal government, which may not have been the case with former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So Moe went out of his way yesterday to thank Carney for allowing him and being on the same page. All of the discussions were, of course, focused on getting the trade negotiations between the U.S. and Canada back on track.
And Murray, just on Alex's point there, and them being on the same page and going and chatting with the Prime Minister and the federal minister before, this is sort of uncharted territory for the premiers and our Premier, and being on the same page as a Prime Minister when it comes to these meetings. Is this surprising to you? Is this something that, with the Premier going down and meeting with some big name officials as well? He's not meeting with some of the junior senators down there.
Well, I'm not a fan of unnecessary travel for the purposes of making yourself look good or looking like you're doing something. I obviously am not a fan of some of the things that have sort of happened in the past in relation to this. And the other reality is we're dealing with Donald Trump, and how he's actually moved by any of this is another thing. All that said, I think this was a good trip. I think you have to judge these events by the circumstances. And the circumstances that we're still living under is the damage that was created by the Ford ads and the need to basically reestablish ties and reestablish relationships. I don't know how significant the relationship is between Scott Moe and the heavy hitters. I suspect it's really not there, but I think establishing that relationship, perhaps getting to someone can possibly get to Trump's ear on how bad this is for the U.S. economy, is much more effective politically, strategically than those ads. Not that the ads were false, not the ads were anything terribly wrong, but they in turn turned out to be ineffective because you're dealing with someone as volatile as Donald Trump. There's other ways to perhaps reach him, maybe. I doubt it, but perhaps this would be at least something worth attempting. So in this particular case, I think Scott Moe probably engaged in what amounts to an exercise that was more productive than maybe some of the other things we've seen in the past, other trips and other things that have been done.
Yeah, it's always difficult to judge these trips based on, the instant reaction of coming back. And now, speaking of some high political drama, a little bit more dramatic, what happened in Parliament this week. The budget vote was tight, and it's not often that we see, a budget vote that's a confidence vote, but that was the case. What did you make of this result, Murray, when it comes to Mark Carney's first major test as Prime Minister?
Well, there's so much focus on the budget and the government just surviving first passage, and the silly games back and forth as to who was going to bring down the government or whether they should. All the stories about whether Andrew Scheer was hiding behind the curtain like the Wizard of Oz or not. I'm not. It's all makes for great political drama. But moving forward, we're still looking at a budget with a substantial amount of of a deficit that's adding to public debt. We're looking at a budget that I don't know necessarily addresses some of the concerns that we're having out here, and those concerns relate to the economy and trade right now. It proceeds with some of the direction that we saw under the previous administration under Trudeau in terms of things like the daycare spending and such, which is good for Saskatchewan. There's significant questions still to be asked on Saskatchewan's role in signing on to that daycare agreement and everything else. We need to get back to the nitty-gritty of how this budget kind of helps us or doesn't help us, and not the focus on whether the government survives or not is exhausting, just going back and forth on the notion of whether we'll have a federal government or not, or as opposed to what that federal government is actually doing. And somehow I think we're kind of losing sight over the fact that, you know what, they survived and everything else. What we got as a result was a not very good budget.
And Alex, there's something the premiers this week came out and said, we don't really necessarily want an election because of the major projects that Murray's talking about, some of the initiatives from the federal government. What were the premiers saying about the potential for another election?
Yeah, there was a number of premiers that came out. Premier Susan Holt of New Brunswick, Ontario Premier Doug Ford, Northwest Territories Premier RJ. They all came out and said essentially, we believe this budget will work for us. We support it. We don't want the government to fall. We don't want another election. We don't want one that could have looked like possibly a Christmas, New Year's Eve kind of election period. So they came out and endorsed the budget. I don't know if it was necessarily ringing endorsements, but a lot of them did say they were supportive. There were things in there they could like. I do think a lot of the premiers were also looking at the major projects that have been recently announced and referred and recommended by Prime Minister Mark Carney. Those are things that they see as appealing. They see as economic drivers, so they want those to be available to them. And of course, if the government follows, that means they might not be around, they might not happen. So I think a number of premiers came out in support.
Yeah, you tear it down and start again if there's an election. Alex, the story of the legislature this week, of course, the rally for the riders, that got a lot of headlines for obvious reasons. But inside the building, when it came to governing, there were still questions about the wildfire response and what the government should or shouldn't do for those affected. What was the NDP calling for?
Yeah, the NDP, and specifically NDP Northern Affairs critic Jordan McPhail, he was calling for the government to waive PST on home construction for those who'd been affected by the wildfires. Essentially, for those who were looking to rebuild their homes, looking to reestablish themselves, especially in the community of Denair Beach, which had that wildfire rip through the community, destroy 200 homes in June. He presented essentially receipts, records showing some residents had received bills where their PST was up to $30,000. He was essentially saying it's unfair for the province to collect this taxes. It should be waived because these people are suffering, he says, because the government didn't act and didn't respond fast enough to the wildfires, but especially because they're looking to rebuild at this time. Now, the government says they are not going to waive PST. They say that is how we collect funds to pay out services and pay out supports, which they have used to support those who were affected by the wildfires.
Hey, Murray, what do you make of that argument from the government?
I don't get this notion that I heard from Minister MacLeod is we don't take political advantages of such situations and play politics when everybody's wearing a Green Rider jersey and they're shutting down the ledge to party with the riders. And of course the politicians do. But I don't even think that's the case here. What political advantage are you really taking over a one-off, a one-time thing in which, in very specific circumstances, people lost their homes and have to deal with the cost of rebuilding? A PST break would not be a precedent. It would be something somewhat humane in terms of people dealing with a tragedy. And I don't know why the government is insensitive to that. Surely they can't be that desperate for the PST revenue as much as it is on a home to basically do a one-off. Surely they can be a little bit more sensitive to the needs of those people. If you have a good idea coming from the opposition, maybe a smart government should basically sit back and say, you know what, this is one in which what you're saying makes sense, and what you're saying would be helpful to people. And I don't think anybody out there would begrudge the particular group of people getting a PST break if they're not, and it wouldn't apply under other circumstances. So it's one of those situations where I don't get their politics, and I don't get why they're doing this. It's not a good look.
We do see the government make exceptions in
Absolutely.
terms of droughts and floods and other natural disasters that happen in the past where they are maybe reaching out for.
It's too bad that people at Denair Beach didn't farm. That's in essence, not to be crass about it, but let's be realistic about whom the government makes exceptions to and whom they don't. And I really think that in itself is game playing that Minister McLeod said he abhors. Well, I don't think that that's much of a different situation. I think it's just being compassionate to a situation.
Murray, Alex, thanks so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.